All right, today we're jumping into a masterclass on realist diplomacy, and we've got three of the most brilliant and, let's be honest, controversial figures in history to guide us. We're going to explore the foreign policies of these absolute giants and figure out what made them so darn effective. Okay, let's get into it.
And just so you know where we're coming from, our entire analysis today is pulled directly from the work of political analyst Kan. He does a really fascinating deep dive into the statecraft of these three men. So the one big idea that ties all three of these guys together is this: balance of power diplomacy. You got to think of it like a dangerous, high-stakes game of chess. The goal isn't always to checkmate your opponent. Nope. It's to keep the board in a state of equilibrium, to make sure no single piece gets powerful enough to just sweep everyone else away.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with Otto von Bismarck, the guy who literally built modern Germany. Then we'll meet Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the ultimate political survivor. And we'll wrap up with Charles de Gaulle, a fierce defender of French independence, before we pull out the big lessons from all their careers. First up is our first Grandmaster, Otto von Bismarck. Now, everyone knows him for uniting Germany, but you could argue that what he did after that was even more brilliant. What's so wild about Bismarck is the pivot you see right here. I mean, it's a total transformation. To create Germany, he was the Iron and Blood Chancellor, a straight-up warlord who kicked off 3 different wars. But the second Germany was unified in 1871, he slams on the brakes and does a complete 180. The warlord becomes a super cautious peacemaker, obsessed not with more conquest, but with pure stability. So why the big change of heart? Well, it's pretty simple. He was smart enough to know that this new, powerful German empire he'd built right in the middle of Europe was now everybody else's biggest threat. His single greatest fear, his nightmare, was that all the other great powers would gang up and crush his new creation. So his entire foreign policy just flipped to prevent that one thing from happening. This led him to build what we call the Bismarck system, and it stood on 4 pillars. First, no more expansion. Germany was, in his words, satiated, full. Second, he actively crushed nationalist movements because he saw them as a powder keg that could blow up Europe. Third, he worked like crazy to keep a delicate balance between the 5 great powers. And finally, he became the biggest champion of avoiding war, calling preventative strikes suicide. He built this incredibly complex web of alliances designed not to win wars, but to stop them from ever even starting. Okay, so let's shift gears. We're going from a man who built a rigid, stable system to a man who survived by dancing through absolute chaos. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the undisputed master of political survival. I mean, just look at this guy's resume. It's insane. Talleyrand served, and then betrayed, 6 different French governments. He went from the old monarchy to the revolution to Napoleon's empire and then back to the monarchy again. The man was the ultimate chameleon. Most people just called him a snake in a traitor. But here's the twist. Was he really a traitor? Our source makes a compelling case. No. His betrayals actually had this stunningly consistent logic. See, while Bismarck built this rigid system to protect his new country, Talleyrand's only constant was an unbreakable loyalty to France itself. He switched sides every single time he believed the person in charge, whether it was a king, a revolutionary, or an emperor, was about to drive the nation off a cliff. And you know who proved this point perfectly? Napoleon. While he was in exile, Napoleon would just rage that his biggest mistake was not having Talleyrand executed. And yet, the moment Napoleon came back to power, who was the very first person he tried to hire back as his foreign minister? You guessed it, Talleyrand. Even his greatest enemies knew the guy was indispensable. But his absolute masterpiece, his crowning achievement, came after Napoleon's final defeat. At the Congress of Vienna, all the winners gathered to basically carve up France. Talleyrand, representing the defeated nation, was facing impossible odds. And he pulls off a diplomatic miracle. He cooks up this brilliant legal argument called legitimacy. He insisted that France itself wasn't the bad guy, the usurper Napoleon was. The real France, the legitimate monarchy, was actually a victim of Napoleon just like everybody else. It was an absolutely audacious argument, but it worked. The victors bought it, and France was safe from being torn to pieces. Okay, let's jump forward to the 20th century and our final Grandmaster, a man who shared Talleyrand's fierce love for his nation, but had to navigate a world dominated by 2 superpowers, Charles de Gaulle. This quote right here gets to the very heart of de Gaulle's thinking. He genuinely believed that if a nation has to rely on another country for its own defense, it just stops being a real nation. It loses its soul, becoming what he called intellectually and spiritually barren. Now think about that. It's the polar opposite of Bismarck, who saw that web of alliances as the key to security. For de Gaulle, that same web was just a trap.
And this core belief led him to forge a totally unique foreign policy, right in the thick of the Cold War. He was deeply suspicious of American dominance. He saw national self-reliance as a moral calling, and he completely rejected the idea of a two-sided world, the US versus the USSR. He fought for a multipolar world, where lots of nations, especially France, could call their own shots. When he looked at NATO, he didn't see a partnership of equals. He saw a system designed to keep Europe, and by extension France, dependent on America's protection. His vision was completely different. A strong, independent Europe that could act as a third pole of power, a heavyweight that could balance both the United States and the Soviet Union.
And look, he wasn't just talking a big game. To make this vision a reality, he took two huge radical steps. First, he yanked France out of NATO's integrated military command, basically kicking American troops off French soil. And second, and this is the big one, he poured France's resources into developing its very own independent nuclear arsenal. He wanted to guarantee that his country's security would never, ever be in another nation's hands again. Okay, so after that tour through 3 centuries of high-stakes diplomacy, what's the bottom line? What can we really learn from these 3 sages of statecraft? This chart here really breaks it down nicely. For Bismarck, the goal was simple: stability for his new empire. And his tool was a complex system of alliances. For Talleyrand, who was always in the middle of chaos, the goal was even simpler: the sheer survival of France. And he got it done through pragmatic face-to-face negotiation. And for de Gaulle, playing in a world of giants, the goal was nothing less than restoring French sovereignty. And his trump card was an independent nuclear bomb. And when you boil it all down, you see what they all had in common. These are the core principles of realism. For all 3, the national interest was the one and only true north. Ideologies like monarchism or liberalism or anti-communism, those were just tools in the toolbox to be used or thrown away as needed. They stayed flexible. They never got locked into any single alliance or plan. And above all, they were masters of the balance of power, always calculating, always figuring out how to keep the world in equilibrium. So I guess the big question these guys leave us with is this. In our world today, which is so tangled up in global alliances and deeply held beliefs, is their kind of cold, calculating, ruthless focus on pure national interest still the best way to keep the peace? Well, that's something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.